This next video focuses on a variety of artists from around the globe and a variety of media, a variety of different types of artwork. And we'll be looking at art from the 1960s until today. The work you see on the screen is the Vietnam Memorial, the work of Maya Lin, an amazing work of land art that cuts into the landscape of Washington, D.C. And we'll talk about why this work was controversial, but is now recognized as an important work of art. But let's start off with the work of Yoko Ono in the 1960s. Yoko Ono is perhaps best known as the wife of John Lennon, but she was a very well-established artist in her own right, who was born in Japan but had moved back and forth from Japan to the United States and was really a global artist in that sense, that she was experienced in the American culture and also Japanese culture. She would create a lot of artwork that included instructions, and in this particular case, this is a performance piece called Cut Piece, or a happening. This was something she performed in cities in Japan, in London, in New York, and she would provide instructions to the audience that they should come up and cut a piece of her clothing off, and it was theirs to keep like a gift. But it was really up to the audience member how much to cut. Most just took a small amount, but depending on where she was, some were more aggressive, some took a lot of clothing. It creates this very kind of awkward encounter on the stage. You can watch clips of it on YouTube, but this was perhaps her most famous work, or one of her most famous works. Happenings, of course, you only can see them at that time. Each one is unique. Women were some of the most important contributors to performance art in the 1960s, creating some of the most innovative performances. And of course, each geographic location, there were different ways that people interacted with this piece. Yoko Ono herself says she goes into kind of a meditative state when she performs this work, and she has re-performed it more recently, and other artists have recreated it as well. Another significant performance piece is the work of Carolee Schneemann, who recently passed away. Her work, Interior Scroll, is quite well known. She also has other very important happenings and performances that engaged her body and that ended up producing works of art from the performances. In this particular case, it was to accompany a gallery exhibit in East Hampton. She came out to do a performance. She was clothed and then changed her clothes and eventually disrobed. She began painting her body and then eventually removed a scroll from her vagina and began reading from it. The way it was recorded was in these kind of reproductions you see here that also include a text where she seems to be calling out a particular filmmaker who is uncomfortable seeing her work. But it is interesting just how aggressively she's engaging the body, and also how she's not shying away from her femininity. The text is literally coming from a part of her femininity from the vagina itself. So another significant work. As we move into the 1980s, we start to see more artwork that engages with text, with artists like Barbara Kruger, and we'll see Jenny Holzer as well. Barbara Kruger was an art director for a magazine, so she was very familiar with kind of magazine layouts, and this is really where a lot of her artwork gets some inspiration. But her text really engages with politics, with social commentary. So here she's thinking about, she has "Your gaze hits the side of my face." It's an untitled work, but this is the text you see here. And so it has to do with things like female objectification. A lot of her work has to do with consumerism and power. And the text really drives home these specific messages. And we're thinking more about conceptual art around this time. It's less about her creating something of great beauty, or her creating a typical oil painting, or even engaging her body in a performance. It's more about the idea behind the work, and that's where conceptual art comes in, and also where a lot of this more kind of postmodern approach to art, less about kind of what is created versus the idea that you see. And Barbara Kruger definitely also seems to incorporate some feminist messages in her work, which you can get a sense of here. Jenny Holzer, as I said, also relied on text, although she communicated it in a slightly different way. She would occasionally use billboards, light up signs, cars, t-shirts, different ways of communicating what she called her truisms. She also had what are called inflammatory essays, short essays. So her texts tend to be short and punchy and communicate a key idea. They can sometimes be very left-wing, very right-wing, or center, but things like private property created crime, the abuse of power comes as no surprise. She has these key lines that kind of jolt you and get you to think. And again, this is more of that conceptual approach to art versus the traditional representations through media like sculpture and painting. Definitely seeing a different direction in the 1980s. To move slightly back, the artist Cindy Sherman again takes a different approach to her artwork. This is her Untitled film still number 6. She had a series of film stills which weren't actually from specific films, but it gave you the illusion of a film, kind of an earlier film, perhaps 20 or 30 years before the creation of the work, where you tend to see these damsels in distress, and you tend to see the kind of angles that you would actually see in a film from that time. So here we see Cindy Sherman, and this is Cindy Sherman. She is the one who would dress up as these different characters. And she would occupy these roles that perhaps when we're seeing them in a film, we wouldn't think twice about. But when we see them in her photography, we really recognize the kind of stereotypes that we often see in filmmaking, and especially in these older films. And it is interesting how she tries to recreate it through, in this case, the bedding, the undergarments the woman is wearing, the way she's looking, the makeup, the hair. And then she has other versions where she's in buildings or outside in landscapes, and she's very careful about what she's representing there as well. She still involves her body in her photographs, and this is just a particularly famous series with the film stills. Another conceptual artist is Sherri Levine. She was part of what's called the pictures generation, where they tended to reuse images that already existed. They could be from advertising or other photographs that already existed. In this particular case, this is called After Walker Evans from 1936. This is literally a reproduction of a photograph taken by Walker Evans, a Depression-era photograph of Allie Mae Burroughs, who was the wife of an Alabama sharecropper. And she's really made very few adjustments. There's some adjustments to the tones, but really it's the exact same photograph in many ways. There's a couple of comments that are going on here. The ideas of reproduction, of copying, also the idea of men typically being the authority figures in art and the ones who are producing art. And so Sherri Levine is saying, I can produce this as well. She also created versions of works by Marcel Duchamp. So these male art makers, she's kind of taking their work and making it her own. And she's not trying to hide the fact that she's reusing it. She's literally calling this one After Walker Evans. So anyone who sees it knows that she's reusing the work of these other artists. This one dates to the early 80s, and she would continue to work in this kind of pictures generation style in the future as well. All right, this is the work by Sonia Boyce, who's a British artist. This is called Missionary Position Number 2, From Lay Back, Keep Quiet, and Think About What Made Britain So Great from 1985. It's watercolor, pastel, and crayon on paper, so some more typical materials, also some more unusual and playful materials in some ways. You can see that she is an artist with African origins, so she's showing us the kind of features perhaps of connecting to an African figure here. She's also showing two elements to her personality. The idea of the part that's really being indoctrinated into the British system. You have a figure that's praying, who's wearing more traditional conservative garment, and a figure who seems to be embracing more Rastafarianism. And you can see little quotes along the bottom, Lord, but look my trials now. So she's also including text into this work. And you can see also the different postures between the two figures. This one is so upright, again in that proper prayer position, whereas this one is reclining, more relaxed, wearing a bolder color, and with that kind of headscarf that's differentiating her from the other figure. So this idea of her occupying two elements or being pulled in two different directions. And for Sonia Boyce, this was perhaps kind of an oversimplification. This is a many-layered type of work. So it's important to think about its different different elements. You can also see she's very interested in these kind of colors and textures that are layered throughout the work. The carpet, the texture of her dress, the pattern of the wallpaper in the background. So quite extraordinary in that sense. Our next artist is Opie, who has created works that are both include the human presence, including the representation of herself, who we see here, and then also works that are more landscape representations. She's an artist based in Los Angeles, and she's created a very well-known freeways series, for example, and Los Angeles freeways are quite well known, and that's devoid of human presence. So she has these very different practices with her photography. In this case, this is a series called Beau, where she did dress herself up as a male figure. She talked about him as kind of a Midwestern looking male figure. You can see the presence of a tattoo, this plaid shirt, the dark pants, the large boots. She's added a mustache, and much of this has to do with ideas of performativity of gender, exploring ideas of queer theory in art, but in this particular case, thinking about how can gender be performed, what are some of the cues that you see, the poses, the clothes, and again, she often did incorporate her own body, her own skin. She has a series also where her skin has been cut into, or a series where she's holding her own children. So her physical presence is often very much part of her own artwork, which we see here in this work, Beau from 1994, again, part of a series. Moving back to 1982, we see this work of Maya Lin, this very significant memorial that is in Washington, D.C. This was created to commemorate the over 58,000 individuals who were either killed or lost in battle in Vietnam. So an extraordinary number of individuals, and it was believed that this controversial war deserved a very significant and moving memorial. The winner of the competition for who would design this memorial was Maya Lin. Maya Lin was a 21-year-old undergraduate at the time. And she's also an Asian American. And so many people felt there may have been some racism in the response to her work. This fact that she was an Asian American, the fact that she was a woman, so some sexism as well. Her age, perhaps, that she was so young. Many people felt like she was not the correct choice for this particular memorial. Many people felt it was too severe, too dark. It didn't include any kind of representational elements. So there were many things that people problematized about this memorial, and different elements were added later, like a sculpture of a representation of a white soldier, a soldier who appears to be of Hispanic origins, and a soldier who appears to be of African American origins. So that's been placed in another part of the memorial. But Maya Lin's memorial since then has really been recognized as revolutionary. It's this highly polished black granite where individuals can see their images reflected. They also can create rubbings of different names, so perhaps family members or people that they know, they can create this rubbing. Also just the starkness, the idea that it seems almost like a scar it also allows us to think about the pain of the Vietnam War, the controversy of this war, and how challenging this war was for the United States. So again, this almost like a scar cut in the landscape is perhaps particularly appropriate for Maya Lin's work. Also, just the fact that it was created in the 1980s, it is going to be this more modern style, using these clean lines, as opposed to the more traditional, ornate, neoclassical memorials that you might see in the past in Washington, D.C. Maya Lin created a more up-to-date, more modern representation of a memorial or version of a memorial. So I think that's important to consider. She's very aware of materials. She's created a lot of other installations, fountains since then, and she uses a lot of these kind of different types of rock memorials, things with engravings and carvings in them, inscriptions in them. So this really set the stage, and I think it's exciting that such a young artist was given the chance to contribute and create such a significant memorial in the United States. Moving on to the Guerrilla Girls from the 1980s. The Guerrilla Girls that's a very important group of anonymous female artists who give themselves the names of famous female artists. So they might call themselves Frida Kahlo or Georgia O'Keeffe or something like that. This is an example of one of the type of posters they would put up in art museums or in public places, essentially to embarrass these arts institutions. The goal was often to point out how underrepresented women artists were. The goal was also to point out how underrepresented artists of color were. Also to point out things like women were often objectified in works of art rather than being the creators of works of art. So essentially, I think a lot of institutions don't think about this. There's always been this traditional acceptance of these main male artists who are often also white, and so by embarrassing them through these types of messages, it's important. So often pointing out which museums haven't given women any solo shows, which museums have no people of color on their boards or women on their boards. So again, these are important messages. So this is a bit of an ironic poster called The Advantages of Being a Woman Artist. So working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men. This is because women were often put in all female shows. This idea of, oh, let's celebrate the women, we'll put them in an all-female show that'll be at the end of the year or something like that. Having an escape from the art world in your 4 freelance jobs, the idea that you can't make it as a woman artist unless you have 4 freelance jobs. Knowing your career might pick up after you're 80, the idea that you have to wait a very long time in order to make it. Being reassured that whatever kind of art you make will be labeled as feminine. And I think this is something we tend to do. So whatever women artists create, you tend to look for those feminine or traditionally female elements in the work. Not being stuck in tenured teaching positions. So tenured means you have a lot of protection in your job if you do work for a university or college. Seeing your ideas live on in the work of others, the idea that the ideas of women are often stolen, having the opportunity to choose between your career and motherhood, so the idea that women have to choose, not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits, the idea that this is what male artists often do, having more time to work after your mate dumps you for someone younger. I don't need to explain that. Being included in revised versions of art history. So again, this idea that women are often included in these special editions of art history or editions of art history that are all about women, or the idea that they're only included in these more unusual texts rather than the traditional survey texts. Not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius, because usually that title is assigned to men, and getting your picture in an art magazine wearing a gorilla suit. And that's because these guerrilla girls would often wear these gorilla suits and gorilla masks, again, to keep them anonymous. Moving on, this is the work of Tracey Emin. This is her bed work, very famous from the late 1990s. Tracey Emin is a British artist, and she created this work after spending 4 days in her bed. You can see she's been drinking. There's evidence of contraception. So what happened was, after these 4 days, she finally got out of bed and she saw this bedroom that she was in. She saw this bed and she saw it as a work of art, and she has installed it in a number of galleries since then, and she continues to reinstall it, and she'll actually arrange it herself. And she always says reinstalling it is somewhat of a traumatic experience for her. Again, this is one of these more conceptual works of art. It's not about a beautiful painting or traditional material. It's about her experience, and the work itself becomes like a work of art. And she often installs it with drawings in the background that perhaps invoke the kind of twirling and spinning of the sheets, or will put the work of other artists around it to kind of put it in dialogue with more traditional works of art. But in any case, you can see the drinks, the cigarettes, the tissues, kind of the trauma of this moment, this belt that she owned. And she often comments that this doesn't reflect her life now. Her life has changed so much in the years since then, but it really encapsulates this moment of difficulty in her life in the late 90s. Moving on to the work of Shirin Neshat, this is a scene from The Last Word, a video or film that she created in 2003. Shirin Shot is an artist living in exile from Iran. So she left Iran after the fall of the Shah and has struggled to return to Iran. She has gone back, but has faced challenges in doing so. She created a controversial series called Women of Allah, where she has women that often incorporate weapons with them. And in this particular case, you really get the sense of the kind of intimidation she senses from the government, from powerful men, but also the power that women have to oppose that. So, for example, you see a man here who has these texts. He seems to be acquiring more and more evidence, saying that he has more and more evidence against this woman. The woman, however, will respond by chanting and by eventually leaving this table. So even though you have this intimidating male figure who has all of these texts and all of this evidence and all of this documentation with him, he's trying to overwhelm her, he's trying to frighten her, she is going to overpower that moment. And she has become more and more interested in filmmaking, but she does create photographs, film, video. That's all part of her work. And this is one of those contributions. This is a recent work by Teresa Margolles, and this is her Muro, Ciudad, Juárez from 2010. If you remember a few years ago, the drug wars in Juárez, the border town in Mexico, were especially terrible. So many people were being lost, being killed in these drug wars. So Teresa Margolles is a Mexican artist, and she's very engaged with the terrible warfare that's happening in Mexico as a result of these drug wars, especially in the city of Juárez. So she's engaged with ideas of the loss of blood. She's incorporated blood into some of her work. She's also incorporated some of the remnants of these battles, like bullets and broken glass, to create jewelry. And in this case, she's actually created the idea of the wall, the border wall, in the city of Juárez, and you can see the barbed wire and the graffiti and the text and the broken nature of this wall. But it's to remind us of the kind of violence and difficulty of this particular city. And she wasn't trained traditionally as an artist, so she really brings a different perspective to the creation of her artwork. But it is important in driving political discussions, just like the work of Shirin Neshat. To end this video, I wanted to not forget the work of Marina Abramovic, who is a very important performance artist who continues on the kind of traditions that we saw with Yoko Ono and Carolee Schneemann. She has been performing for decades and decades and has completed some very challenging performances that are incredibly physically difficult. And I think that's something important to remember, that a lot of these performances were very hard on the body, that you literally need to train your body to engage in these performances. And she often talks about this, Marina Abramovic often talks about this, the idea of she's in training before a specific performance. She had an exhibition at MoMA, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it was something to recreated a lot of her performances. There were other artists who recreated them. It also recorded them and shared them through a number of media. But in this particular case, she actually also performed daily by sitting at a table, sitting at a chair and looking across a table at someone who just would line up and take a turn to sit across from Marina Abramovic. And so she would sit there all day for hours and hours at a time throughout the run of the show. So again, this idea of being able to get into almost a meditative state and to sit for that amount of time, and the idea that she had to train herself to do so. So a really incredible type of exhibition to be able to put your body through that and to also be present throughout your entire exhibition that celebrates your performances. So this was an especially significant type of artist performance just for its longevity, for its duration. And there's actually a film that records this important performance. So I know that was quite a variety of artists, but I wanted to mention all those significant women and their artwork, and hopefully it gives you a good sense of what's happened in the last few decades.